some atheists began saying that the genetic code is not a code. And, you know, I don't know a single biologist who agrees with that, and I'm including all the atheists like Richard Dawkins. When Richard Dawkins was asked about that, he said, "That's ridiculous. Who's saying that?" And why are they saying that? Because, well, first of all, they're not scientists, they're not biologists, they don't understand what the genetic code is. And they hate the idea that there is a code because that implies somebody wrote a code. A code implies a coder. You don't get a code spontaneously, from nothing.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations at the Desk. Today in conversation with me is the American biochemist Dr. Sai Garte. Dr. Garte has served as Division Director at the Center for Scientific Review at the National Institutes of Health and has held tenured professorships at New York University, Rutgers University, and the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Garte has published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles and is the author of several books, including Science and Faith in Harmony, Contemplations on a Distilled Doxology, and the work of his hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith, which details his own conversion from atheism to Christianity. His most recent book is Beyond Evolution, How New Discoveries in the Science of Life Point to God. Welcome, Dr. Garte, to the show.
You're welcome. Great to be here.
First off, the title of your book is quite fascinating and indeed quite provoking, Beyond Evolution. What inspired you to write this book, and can you briefly explain your journey from atheism to Christianity?
Well, the inspiration for the book was what I've been reading in the literature about some of the things that interest me in biology, including the concept of purpose and agency and cognition throughout life. And there's a lot of really fascinating new findings coming out, which are not well known to the public and which are still fairly controversial, even in the biological community. But I think they're important to bring out because I think they have lots of important implications for our belief in God, belief in the Creator. The other motivation was I've become very concerned about the divisions within the church related to evolution. I think that that's unfortunate because for several reasons, which I go through in the book in detail. I don't think that evolution is an issue that we Christians should be fighting about. It's fairly minor and it leads to some very strong passions which are not just not necessary on both sides. So the first part of the book is about that, and then I go into detail as to why evolution is not such an important issue. And in fact, biologically, it is not the most important principle in biological science. Something else is, which is the fact of very accurate replication of life, all forms of life, what we call inheritance, uh, which is which is important for evolution to even work. So before you can have evolution, you have to have this in place, and that includes all the mechanisms of protein synthesis, which are very, very complex, and I go into that in some detail. Even in the appendix, I have a lot of more much deeper discussion of the complexities of that system for people who are interested. Otherwise, the book is written mostly for the layperson. It's not a scientific text, although I do have a lot of references. And the reason for that is because some of the things I'm writing about are quite controversial, and I don't want people to think this is just my own idea. They come from the published literature, and so I give lots of references to back them up. So that's those are the motivations for writing the book, and I'm very grateful to Tyndale House, the publisher, who took the chance to publish it, and So far, it's doing okay. It's gotten a lot of endorsements, some good reviews, and we'll see how it goes. But it was just released about a week ago. Um, it's now available in the United States. I don't know where else yet, but it will eventually come elsewhere, I'm hoping.
Yeah, I'm thankful for the review copy. I really had a fascinating time reading through the book, and especially if you are watching this and you want a brief, even a history of the evolutionary theory itself, how it started and where it is, I
Mm.
believe this is the book that you should have on your shelf. It's written for even from a layman point. It's something that you should definitely read if you're interested in and around these things. So, Dr. Gard, before we dwell further, what exactly is evolution and what it is not? Because there's a lot of confusion and controversy around that term itself.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think yes, I've written an essay called "What Evolution Is Not." It's actually one of the chapters in my first book, I believe. Um, and so many people argue about evolution without really knowing what they're talking about. In the book, I give one example of a person on social media who was arguing against evolution. And he was using the example of the moths that changed from white to black because of the industrial revolution, which caused a lot of soot in England, and everything was very black, and the tree bark became black. So the moths that were black lived better than the ones who were still white because the white ones could easily be seen and eaten by the birds, whereas the black ones couldn't. And his argument was that he said it's not that any white moth gave birth to any black moths. It's just that the white moths were eaten and the black moths weren't. So eventually there were no more white moths. So no evolution happened. And I said, I'm sorry, you have described exactly what evolution is. No animal gives birth to anything other than what it is itself. So all black moths only give birth to black moths, white moths only to white moths. And that's true for every animal. And that goes back to the Bible where it says each according to its kind in Genesis. Um, Most people don't understand that. They think that evolution means, I mean, most people who are opposed to evolution think that evolution means that somehow or other a dog or a wolf gave birth to a dog, or a chimp gave birth to a human, or I don't know, whatever. A fish gave birth to to a goat. I mean, no. That's not how evolution works. That's not what evolution says. So if you are going to say that no banana can ever give rise to a lion, you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen. What happens is that evolution works in populations, not in individuals. So what you have, if, for example, in the moth example, is the guy was exactly right. There were white moths and there were black moths, and each one only gave birth to the same kind, each according to its kind. But what happened was when the trees got darker, the white moths were easy to see, and they all got eaten. So the population of moths changed from half white and half black to all black. That was the evolution. It's a change in population over time because of mutations, or what Darwin called was variation, because he didn't know the mechanism. He didn't know about mutations. But we now know that the variations that he talked about were due to mutations. And if some mutations are beneficial, and some are harmful. The harmful ones won't survive. The beneficial ones will survive, and that depends on the environment and natural selection. So it's a very simple thing, and it's not even a new law of nature. It's just logic, and it follows directly from the idea of strong inheritance. And what I go through in this book, in chapter 3, is the idea, which is still controversial, and I've had some pushback against it, but it's true, is that the only entities that we know of that can reproduce themselves are living entities. Nothing outside of life does accurate self-replication. The first thing everybody says to me is, well, what about crystals? Crystals reproduce. They make copies of themselves. They do. They make copies of themselves by breaking, and then each of the two broken pieces grow up, but they don't do it accurately. There's so many errors when a crystal breaks. They break differently. They break in different patterns. So the new crystals are not exactly the same as the original ones. And with every generation, the differences grow. And it turns out, and this has been proven by several people, including myself, in a recent paper in the journal called Biosystems, if you don't have accurate, very, very accurate self-replication, over 99% accuracy, if you don't have that, what you're going to get eventually with time is you're not going to be able to have evolution because all the changes that occurred, all the mutations that occurred are not going to be preserved. So you must have this kind of high accuracy self-replication of cells before you can even have evolution working. So you couldn't get that system by evolution because you need evolution, you need accurate self-replication before evolution can start. So that's a fairly controversial statement, although it's been proven, it was first proven by Manfred Eigen way back, many decades ago. But a lot of people didn't understand it, and but it's a very important point because that's the key principle in how life operates.
Mhm.
And we understand how it works. We understand about protein synthesis and how all that works, but we have no clue how it began, just as we have no clue how life began.
So in your book, you do argue that, as you rightly alluded to, that the most fundamental principle of biology isn't evolution, but
That's
accurate
right.
self-replication leading to inheritance. Now, could you
Exactly.
unpack that a little more, particularly with respect to the genetic code, because I know that you go into the details in your book. And what does, because there's a lot of confusion also on what the genetic code is, and sometimes from the atheist side as well, do you really mean that there is information in the DNA? So
Yeah.
what is the genetic code, and what does accurate self-replication involve?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you. What's fascinating to me is what you just said about atheists. I don't know when it started. I think about 3 or 4 years ago, some atheists began saying that the genetic code is not a code. And, you know, I don't know a single biologist who agrees with that, and I'm including all the atheists like Richard Dawkins. When Richard Dawkins was asked about that, he said, "That's ridiculous. Who's saying that?" And why are they saying that? Because, well, first of all, they're not scientists, they're not biologists, they don't understand what the genetic code is. And they hate the idea that there is a code because that implies somebody wrote a code. A code implies a coder. You don't get a code spontaneously, from nothing. So, yes, it is a code, it is information. The information in that code, it contains words. We call them codons. And these words are 3 units of DNA. And the units are, you have these letters A, C, G, T. There's the four nucleotides in DNA. And in the order in which they're found, so it could be ACG, TAC, whatever those three, there's 64 possible uh, codons based on those. All of those have a meaning. And what they mean is each one of those three-letter codes, those codons, tells the ribosome while it's making proteins, put a particular amino acid next. So if it's CCC, that means put a glycine here. I think it's CCC. I always forget the code. But anyway, it says put a glycine, nothing else. That is the amino acid we need in this protein. And the reason that's important is because the sequence of the amino acids in the proteins are what give it its function, its ability to do whatever it's doing. If it's an enzyme, the enzyme works pretty much if it has only the correct sequence of amino acids. There's some exceptions, but that's the general idea. So how do you make these proteins which have exactly the right sequence? Well, that's where the genetic code comes in. It's an amazing story, and I try to go into it generally in the book and in more detail in the appendix. And if you read that, you'll say to yourself, guaranteed, everybody does. I did when I was an atheist graduate student. I said, what? How is that possible? This is an amazing system. It actually seems to be like a machine because the ribosome has a slot. And now, if people are my age, they might remember way back at the beginning of computers, you would feed a tape into the computer, and the tape had all the information. What the ribosome does is it takes a tape of information into the slot that it has. That tape is RNA, which is copied from the DNA in the right sequence. And once it's in the ribosome, that tape then orchestrates this amazing biochemical process of producing just the right protein with just the right sequence. That process is so complicated, it's so complex, there's no way it could possibly have arisen or originated from just natural chance. It's impossible. If you want to think about it another way, and I use this analogy a lot, think about if you see a house that you really love. You go to visit somebody's house and you love it. You love everything about it, the way it's built, the shelves, the paintings on the wall, the books on the shelves, the plumbing, the heating, all the systems that make the house work. And you say to your friend, I would love this house. I'm going to make one exactly like it. And you could do that. It wouldn't be easy, but you could do it. But what you can't do is go to a house like that and find one that would make a copy of itself. No house can make a copy of itself. No factory can make a copy of itself. Why not? The house can't make a copy of itself because it has to make machines that will make all the things. How does that work? You can't do it. Life does it, and life is the only thing that does it. And the way life does it is by making very specific proteins, because every protein is a tiny molecular machine. And each protein does the other things, like make the various structures in the cell, make all the compounds that are needed for the cell, do everything that happens in the cell is done by proteins, by enzymes. So that's unique. That's totally unique. Only life does this. And we don't know how it started. We have no idea how that could have started out.
Yeah, so the discovery of the genetic code and the DNA structure has been quite a revolutionary point in the history of biological sciences. And one of the interesting claims that you make is obviously that evolutionary science itself and biology as a whole is experiencing a paradigm shift, very similar to what happened in physics um, over a century ago at the turn of the 20th century. What is this paradigm shift and why does it really matter?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what happened in physics was what's often called a paradigm shift, which occasionally happens in science. In the end of the 19th century, a lot of physicists thought they were done. That everything had been solved. Thermodynamics had been solved. Mechanics obviously was known. People knew about gravity. Everything was known except there was one thing that didn't make sense, and that was the speed of light is constant, no matter whether you're going to it or away from it. How could that be? So nobody knew what to do about the speed of light. They didn't know if it was a wave, what kind of a wave is it? They had no idea what it was. And Einstein came up with the answer, which was crazy. He said the speed of light is constant because time changes. Time slows down when you go really, really fast. And everybody said, "What? What do you mean time slow? That's not what that's that's nonsense. What is he talking about?" Well, he was right, as it turned out. It was proven. And at the same time, Max Planck had discovered that uh, outside of all logic and reason, it turns out that there are very small particles like atoms and subatomic particles that can have energy levels that go from one state to another without going everything in between. So that's as if you're heating water and it's cold and it's cold and you keep putting heat into it. It stays cold and all of a sudden it's hot. It never gets warmer. It just goes from cold to hot. Does that make sense? No, but it's true. Okay, so what happened in physics in the beginning of the 20th century was that a lot of things were discovered that were true but made no sense in terms of human understanding. It wasn't logical. Yes, people were saying that's crazy, that's ridiculous. Einstein, brilliant as he was, thought quantum mechanics was bad. It was not true, couldn't be real. Eventually, he accepted it, but it was very difficult for him. And where are we in biology? We're stuck. We have making no progress in understanding the origin of life. There are other things in biology that we cannot understand, like human consciousness. That's a biological thing, I guess, where nobody even knows what it is. Atheists have come to the point of saying, well, we can't make any sense of it, so it's probably not real. It doesn't exist. That's what Daniel Dennett, the atheist philosopher, wrote a whole book about that. Well, that's not a very good answer. It's certainly not a very good scientific answer. We know consciousness exists. It's not an illusion. We know free will exists. Sam Harris said, no, there's no free will. Well, come on. I, I decided to come on your show. You decided to invite me. That's both free will. I don't think anybody put a gun to your head. We make decisions all the time. We make choices and they're real. So if there's no such thing as free will, everybody should just shut up because there's no point in talking anymore. So that's what happens when atheists get stuck with something in reality, a real thing in science, and they don't like it. The genetic code they don't like, consciousness they don't like, free will they don't like. All of these things point to something beyond what we can know from pure science as we know it. And they don't like that. Everything has to be completely explained, and it isn't. The other thing that evolution cannot explain, not just consciousness, but all the things that humans do, talking on the internet to each other. No other animal does that, right? No, nothing else alive, paints the kinds of pictures that people have painted or does the kind of music that people have invented and sung and played. I mean, there's so many things that just don't come from evolution. They're much more, they're beyond it. And that's why the book is called Beyond Evolution. Evolution, I believe that evolution is correct. I think it does explain a lot, but it does not explain everything. It is not the all-encompassing truth. And that's where we need a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift is happening not from Christians, not from Christianity, not from some belief in a spiritual God. It's coming from mainstream biologists who are not religious at all. And they're seeing the truth that there is actually purpose in all of life, not just human beings, but even bacteria act with purpose. And even bacteria have cognition. And I have two chapters about that, which are, I think, the most probably disturbing chapters for people who are who
Yes.
are not willing to accept change. But yes, what you said was true, is that biology is now ready for a huge paradigm shift. It's time for biology to grow.
Yeah.
And and that's why I wrote the book, because people have to know about these new discoveries, which are amazing.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating because even for the viewers, what I found particularly very useful is that the book Beyond Evolution definitely stands in between what's happening in the wider academic community and the what the popular media might not be telling you about
That's
this
right.
shift that is happening, right?
Exactly.
So when we talk about evolution, we often see that there is a tendency to swing the pendulum to either extremes. One is to be
Yes.
dismissive of it, call it bogus. From Christian circles, we kind of see those kind of responses. The other is what we might call evolutionism, to say that
Yes.
evolution has kind of sorted it all out. To use
Right.
what Dawkins famously said, it makes me an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So,
Right.
there are these two extremes, and what I see that you're taking is more of a middle path, saying that yes, evolution is correct in a lot of things that it says, but well, there's yet a lot to explain, and without agency and cognition, which I would want to talk about. I would want you to talk about more in detail further. But what do you say about the two extremes that we see in the culture?
No, you're absolutely correct. I think both of them are mistaken, and so the two extremes have become. Look, I mean, I don't know what's going on where you are, but in America, there's so much division right now. There's so much enmity. Everybody's yelling at everybody else, whether it's politics or science or anything. It's just crazy. And within the church, we have to learn how to tolerate each other. I mean, there's always been disagreements in the church. And I like to quote Acts chapter 15, where there was a big disagreement about, what should we do about people, about all these uh, Gentiles who want to convert to Christ. Do they have to become Jewish first? Do they have to follow the laws, all that? And there was a big disagreement. The council had an argument, and they came up with a compromise, and they agreed what to do. And that was of historic importance, and the church, did well. And so it's not bad to have disagreement. I think it's good, but what you have to do is love each other, even when you don't agree. And I had an experience like that recently when I was talking to somebody from the Discovery Institute, Douglas Axe, who doesn't like evolution at all. And we were talking together on the Sean McDowell
Yeah,
show,
yeah.
and we ended up being good friends, even though we strongly disagreed about evolution, and neither of us convinced the other. But who cares? I mean, you see what I'm saying? It you can disagree about some things, but if you agree that Jesus Christ is our Savior and that He died on the cross and rose on the third day, and you know we serve a loving God. I mean, that's important. Whether whether evolution can explain this or that is of minor significance in comparison. So that's how I feel about these two extremes. I think both extremes should relax a little, listen to the other people a little more, and uh, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because ultimately evolution is not that important. It's one of several things that are amazing about biology, but it's not the most important one, and it's not the deepest.
So yeah, about the other extreme where evolution generally in popular discourse becomes synonymous with atheism, right? But
Hmm.
of the recent paradigm shift that we've already spoken about, and for those interested, Dr. Gard does go into details of these phenomena in his book. Of which, what I found most interesting is the comeback of terms like teleology and purpose into the discourse.
Yes.
Dawkins
Right.
famously said that, at the bottom, it's a blind, pitiless indifference. There is no purpose at all.
That's
And
right.
you argue that this new research is opening the doors to kind of discussions where teleos and purpose is back in dialogue. Could you
Yes.
tell us more about that?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. The first thing I like to say is that in 2023, which is only 2 years ago, a new book came out published by MIT Press, uh, edited and written many chapters, about 18 chapters, written by mainstream scientists. I don't know if any of them are Christians. I don't know of any who are Christians. Edited by some very famous people like James Shapiro and Dennis Noble, Stuart Kaufman, several other, Peter Corning, several other very well-known scientists. And the title of the book is amazing. The title of the book is Evolution on Purpose. Now, the idea of using the word purpose in a title with evolution would have been blasphemy and and absolutely unheard of in science 5 years ago. And what the book contains is amazing. Every chapter is talking about teleology in all kinds of organisms, bacteria, molds, fungi, you know, not to mention animals and plants, of course, which we know have purpose and they act with agency. In other words, they decide to do things. What's I think, which I bring out in the book, I think what's really important to realize is that agency and purpose are not present in physics or chemistry, right? I mean, nobody ever talks about a rock deciding to roll down a hill. It rolls down the hill because something pushed it and then gravity pulls it down. So everything in physics and chemistry obeys the natural laws of science, but biology, that's not the case. In biology, organisms do things on their own. They don't wait to be pushed or pulled or whatever. They will get up and walk or they will slither around or whatever. They're looking for food. And they're looking for food to survive. They have a purpose. And they have other purposes as well. So that's the first thing that has started to make a comeback, and it's really important. The other thing that's even more crazy, when I first read it, I couldn't believe what I was reading, is this idea that all of life, including bacteria and single cells, has cognition. Now, what I mean by cognition, that's not consciousness. What cognition is the ability to sense the environment, to make sense of the environment, to understand that yeah, there are things that you have to remember that happened, and you have to act in a way that relates to what you remember, and you predict things that will happen, and you work with others, and you recognize friends versus enemies. All these are cognitive things that we do. Bacteria do exactly the same thing. They do it with a different mechanism. They sense the environment not by looking at it or hearing it. They sense it chemically through chemical receptors that react. So that's like smell. The sense of smell is the same thing that developed evolutionarily from this original way of sensing things. It's about detection of molecules. So, but the fascinating thing about this new discoveries in cognition is that it's not only that bacteria and other cells can sense the environment. There's, just to give you an example of one experiment that was done in the lab, which is amazing, is there's bacteria that are able to shift their metabolism if the oxygen level gets low. They switch to an anaerobic or a different kind of metabolism so they can survive. But it takes a while because once the oxygen level gets low, then the bacteria takes a while for them to switch. And of course, many of them die. However, if you do artificially, if you raise the temperature just before you lower the oxygen level, and you keep doing that, the bacteria will, at some point, as soon as you've raised the temperature, they don't wait for the oxygen level to go down. They, in advance, change their metabolism so they're ready for it when it happens. In other words, they have learned that raising temperature leads to lower oxygen. Better do something first. They've learned it just like we learn things. This is like Pavlov's dogs, right? And how do they do that? We don't know. There's some theories that there are some structures in these cells that act like what's called nanobrains. Now, I know people think I'm making all this up. No, these are actual experiments. I'm not making it up. And nobody has they're not trying to prove anything other than this is how biology works. So what we now know is that all of life is way more advanced than we ever thought, even the simplest forms. And again, we don't know how this happened. Why is it that everything alive has acts with agency to fulfill a purpose, and part of the way they act is by cognition? It's incredible.
Wow. Wow, that's very interesting. I mean, it's quite suggestive of some divine purpose behind all of
Yes,
this. Yeah.
exactly.
And another fascinating idea that you do explore in detail in the book is that of evolutionary convergence, right? The repeated emergence of similar
Yeah,
solutions in different evolutionary chains or long
right,
history lines.
right.
Could you also unpack that a bit? Because I asked
Sure.
this question in specifically uh, because in the wider culture, evolution is still thought of as a very random, you know,
Hmm.
through random
Yeah,
mutations and natural selections, that if you were to turn the clock backwards, you would have
right, right,
ended up in a completely different um, scenario altogether. But what
right.
is the recent evidence telling us on that?
So yeah, that was Stephen Jay Gould's idea was that if you wound the clock backwards, you get something completely different because it's totally random. And well, there's a great British biologist named Simon Conway Morris who has published several books on this and done a huge amount of studies. He's a brilliant scientist. I met him once. He's just amazing. And he has found and shown without doubt, I mean, that there's no arguing with his conclusions, that it's not true, that there are examples of one of the best examples, and I have a picture of it in the book, is the convergence of the eye structure in humans and octopus. Now that didn't come through. That's not a direct line because the octopuses are invertebrates, and we separated from them a long time ago, probably before anybody could see anything. And however, both animals ended up with the same eye structure, and that's only one example of hundreds of examples of structures and pathways that are the same all around life without having a direct evolutionary following. Okay. So flying with wings, you find that in insects, in birds, in some mammals like bats. And they're all very similar. The structures of the wings are very similar. The mechanism of flying is very similar. These are just the ones that we know. There are so many others that we don't even know about because they're not physical, obvious physical structures, but ways that the biochemistry works in different kinds of organisms. So the question is, what does that imply? And Conway Morris says that this implies that there are some laws in biological science that we don't know about yet that allow some things and not others. And and so if you wound the clock back, like Stephen Jay Gould said, you might get some differences, but most things would be pretty much the way they are. In other words, you'd probably still have mammals, and you'd probably still have reptiles and birds, and you'd probably still have humans, although that might be trickier. But you never know, because I don't think I think humans are a creation of God, so that's a whole nother subject. But
Interesting.
I think, you that would happen because God is still there. So Gould's conclusion, I mean, Gould was a brilliant man, of course, but I think he was wrong on this one. And it's not true that anything can happen and it's all a matter of chance. There is something we don't know or some things that we don't know about that are laws of biology that make some things happen and not others.
So Conway Morris's view, which is this process structuralist view, that it was
Yes,
always goal directed, right? It was always coming. Um,
right.
that is very suggestive of a fact that it's it's a whole show that is being directed by a mind or an agent outside.
Yes, yes,
But we always have this issue of, or let's say, an anti-supernatural bias in science, a methodological
yeah,
naturalism, so to speak. So, do you
right.
think that at any point in the future, would science I know that we are discussing agency and cognition and all of that, but would it explicitly open the door to a divine food?
That's a very good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. But what I do think is this. I don't have any objection to limiting science to understanding the natural because that's what science as we know it does. We don't have any way I would never suggest that we could explore the nature of God scientifically. I don't see how we could do that. It's outside, by definition, science defines the natural world. It doesn't tell us everything about the supernatural world. However, and here's where I often disagree with my atheist colleagues, what science can do is point to the reality of God by not by proving it, because first of all, science doesn't prove anything, and not even by very strong evidence, but by providing some kinds of evidence that are suggestive of what you just said, a deity, a supernatural deity outside of space and time, outside of the universe, who created the universe and created everything and created life, created humans. Uh, we're never going to be able to show that definitively, scientifically. That's not how science works, unless we invent a whole new kind of science, which I don't know anything about. But at the moment, that doesn't work. So what we do is what I'm looking to do is to show people that, first of all, nothing in science suggests atheism. It just says, of course, everything science shows is naturalistic because science has to work in nature. It's a naturalistic thing. So we can't understand the nature of love. We can't understand the nature of creativity, of beauty, scientifically. Now, there are people who do, and that's called scientism, right? That's the idea that everything is explainable by science. Scientism is simply false. It's wrong. And there's some funny stories about how bad it is. But uh, so what do we do? Well, I think we should do as much science as we can, find the things that we find. All these discoveries that are being made about biology tell us scientifically that we need some new laws. We need some new theories because we can't explain the origin of life right now at all. We can't explain the origin of the genetic code. We can't explain the origin of the universe. We can't explain the origin of humanity and its consciousness. So maybe we never will scientifically. Maybe this is only a question of metaphysics and of religious views. It might be we can explain some of it scientifically through maybe some through some new theories, but we don't know how good those explanations will be. And it's very likely, I think, that when we get those kinds of theories, they'll be a little bit like quantum mechanics. They won't make a lot of sense to people. Some people will say, like they said with quantum mechanics, that's crazy. That can't be real. And then we'll do experiments to find out that they are. When I tell people that bacteria think and remember and act on their memories, they say that's nonsense. But it's proven. I mean, these experiments were done. So you may not like it, but it's true. And the more we do now in these areas, the more it's going to be, I believe, it's going to be clear that we're missing something. Whether we can fill it in according to the rules of science or whether we need something whole brand new like Einstein did and Planck did, that I don't know. And hopefully somebody will figure that out, but that's not going to be me.
Interesting, interesting. I think just to allude what you said some time back, that biology is also the science of biology or the study of biology is also stuck for a while now. That and one of the areas in which a lot of research is happening, and you do mention this, is the origin of life itself, even before evolution, right? What
Yeah.
is the status in the abiogenesis field and where we are? How far or how close are we to finding an answer?
That's very controversial. James Tour, who's a friend of mine who I'll be talking with tomorrow, he's a chemist, organic chemist, and he says that no progress has been made at all, that we're nowhere, we don't have a clue. He's not completely wrong. I think some progress has been made, but as soon as the progress is made, it turns out it doesn't really help. So there was a while when everybody thought they had the answer. We thought we all had the answer, which was that life started with RNA. There was an RNA world. RNA was able to do both replicate itself and catalyze biochemical reactions. So that made RNA a very attractive candidate. The problem is it doesn't do either one very well. RNA world is just about dead now, and I'm not just talking about me and a few other Christians, but the field itself has said no, there's too many problems with RNA alone. Maybe the original world was RNA plus peptides or RNA plus proteins. Nobody really knows. Considering the amount of time and effort that has gone into research and to try and understand the origin of life, we've made very, very little progress. And see, here's the thing. Jim Tour talks about the very first steps, the making of the chemicals, and how hard it is to make these chemicals. DNA, protein, lipids, RNA. But the fact is, and I am a biochemist, and I say, yeah, even if we had all of these molecules, and we do, we have all these molecules, we can make them. But that doesn't give us life because we can put all these molecules together in a membrane and nothing happens. They just sit there. They're not alive.
Interesting.
And why are they not alive? Because if you look at a cell, you don't just see a solution of molecules. You see biochemical machinery. You see the ribosomes, you see the RNA, you see enzymes doing amazing things. You see structures like ATP synthase, which is an amazing biochemical machine. And I talk about those in details in the appendix
Yeah,
to the book.
yeah.
Uh, and how do these all, I mean, how do you do these? How do you make these? It's kind of like saying, okay, you want to build a house, you got to have a plumbing system. Here's all the pipes. If I were given all the pipes, I wouldn't know what to do next. You have to put them together. You have to make them work.
Interesting.
And so we're so far away. I don't see any major breakthroughs coming along.
Interesting. And yeah, as Dr. Gart rightly mentioned, James Tour is one person that if you're watching this, you should definitely be checking out his space as well, because there's a lot of work that he's been doing on the origin of life research himself.
Yeah.
Um, Finally, Dr. Gard, before we close, how does this all, I know you will give me a scientist perspective, but from your perspective, how does this all tie in to the Genesis narrative? Because that is where a lot of confusion and debates and
Yes.
conversations within the church are located.
Right. So several things to say about that. First of all, I am not by any means a biblical scholar, and so uh, what I say may be completely ridiculous to people who know better. I did come to faith very late in life, and I have read the Bible, but I'm not a scholar at all. So take that into account. But I think that the Bible, from what I see from my own reading and from what I've read from other scholars, is that the idea of reading the Bible and saying this is all literally true is just nonsense because even the people who say that don't take it all as literally true. Jesus made that very clear. He didn't, how did he preach? He preached by telling us things, what to do, how to live, but he also told us a lot of parables. Parables are not literal. They're stories to make a point. And, Jesus, if Jesus did that, I trust that method. I think that's probably good. And now in the Old Testament, I mean, the Old Testament is a collection of books. It's written by different people. It has all kinds of different styles. It's an amazing set of works. And as I said, they're all different. Some are pure history, some are, poetry, obviously, wisdom. But Genesis is amazing because to me, Genesis is like a pure theological text. And what is it telling us? It's telling us that God created everything, including the things that other people thought were gods, like the sun and the moon. And it doesn't tell us how God did that. When it comes to life, it tells us that God created life. It doesn't tell us how. He spoke, let there be, and we don't know how that worked. It worked, so we could just say miraculous. I don't think there's any way to know. But we do have some clues in Genesis. That line, each according to its kind, which is repeated something like 20 times in the book of Genesis, I think is a huge clue. And what that is telling us, and I say this in the book, that's telling us that the key thing in life is accurate inheritance. Because each being created by God is according to its kind. So rabbits give birth to rabbits, tulips give birth to tulips. Every living thing reproduces each according to its kind. That's a pretty good scientific statement right there. But the other thing to understand about the Bible, which is made really clear in the book of Job, which is one of my favorite books, when God answers Job, starting with chapter 38, what God is telling him is, there's no way you can understand how I made the world. You weren't there. And not only were you not there, even if you had been there, you wouldn't have known how to do it. You still don't know how it happened. And he doesn't tell us how it happened. He's saying, I'm God. I created everything. You guys have a long way to go. And one thing that I always love to point out about the Bible, and especially the New Testament, Jesus Christ was God incarnate on earth. He could have told us everything. He could have explained quantum mechanics to us. He didn't. Jesus doesn't say one word about science in the entire New Testament. Why not? Because that's not his job. It's our job. Because science is always changing, and we need to keep changing and learning. If Jesus had told us the truth about science, if Jesus had told the people of his day all the truth things about science we now know, nobody would have understood a word of it. If Jesus comes back now and tells us today the truth about science, we wouldn't understand a word of it because what we now know today, that's not the end. So that's the point. Science is the human path to knowledge of the natural world that we were given the ability to do that from God. And now it's up to us to do it. That's how I feel about science. And someday we will find all the truth. And when we do that, all the scientific truth, it will be exactly the same as the truth of the Bible because
Interesting.
there's only one truth.
Interesting. Just before we close, Dr. Gart, I know that most of the conversations that I've watched of you Generally, at the right at the start, they ask you about it, and you do give a brief account of how you, from an atheist background, came to faith. Why don't we close with that? Tell us
Okay.
briefly your story of how you came to faith, because particularly as a scientist, um, it is often thought that science leads someone away from God, but you
Yeah.
came to life at a very later stage in your career as well. How did that happen?
Right. So I was raised in a family, three generations of atheists. So I had absolutely no background in religion of any kind, God, anything like that. I thought Christianity was evil. That's how I was taught. Wrong and evil, both. So I had a long way to go, but it started with science. As I said, when I was studying the details of quantum physics as a chemistry major in college, I first found out that this doesn't make a lot of rational sense, and I wondered how that could be true because I had been taught that everything depended on being rational and making sense. And quantum mechanics didn't work that way, so I got a little concerned. And then in graduate school, I majored in biochemistry, got my degree, my PhD in biochemistry. And there, for example, as I mentioned, when I was learning about protein synthesis, I mean, I felt chills going up and down my spine. I couldn't believe it. How could this be? This is an incredible system. And so that I didn't stop being an atheist, but I started wondering. I started thinking there was something missing in life, something spiritual, and I think a lot of people born an atheist eventually get to that idea that there's something missing. And I didn't know what it was, and I explored a lot of things. And I didn't have any idea. But what happened was my mind had been opened by becoming an agnostic, by becoming someone who says, I really don't know. And I was able to receive the Holy Spirit without knowing it. And I had several dreams. And again, I'm not going to discuss these because it's too long, but they're in my first book, The Works of His Hands. I had a number of dreams and a couple of waking experiences that were incredibly powerful. And this happened over several decades. Wasn't all at once. And finally, the final thing that happened was a waking experience I had where I feel like I encountered the Holy Spirit. And at the end of that experience, I realized that Jesus was real, and I said, I believe, and I became a Christian. And that was in late middle age. So it hasn't been very long. I was only baptized about 13 years ago. But now I feel that my mission is to do exactly what you mentioned, which is to destroy that myth that science should drive people away from faith, that you can't be a scientist and also be faith and also be a Christian. All of these terrible lies that we've been taught have to be exposed. And I'm not the only one doing this. There's quite a few people writing books like this, and people who are scientists who have come to faith and who are showing how it's completely harmonious to be a scientist. And you don't have to give up any of your scientific worldview to believe in Jesus, and you don't have to give up any of your Christianity to accept science and follow it.
Amen to that. And thank you so much, Dr. Garte, for your work and for the ministry that you're doing as well, along with your scientific endeavors. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for coming on the Carpenter's Desk. And to our viewers, again, Beyond Evolution is a book that you should have on your shelf. We've only been able to scratch the surface with some of the fascinating things that are being discussed in this book. Highly recommend it, and the link to the book is also in the description below. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do subscribe to the Carpenter's Desk as well. Thanks again, Dr. Garte, once more.
Thank you.